Section 22 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corinne LePage. Pantropheon by Alexis Soyer. Fish, Part 1. Fish. Perhaps it has not been sufficiently remarked that the science of ichthyophagy is generally developed in a direct ratio with the civilization of a people. Man began at first by satisfying the imperious necessities of his stomach. He then eat to live, and all was good to him. Experience by degrees gave rise to eclectism, choice. It was then discovered that a coarse and solid food might be replaced by a delicate and savory alimentation. Joyous appetite and sensuality, its effeminate companion, took the place of hunger, and this happy couple gave birth to the more amiable of fairies, who, under the name of gastronomy, was soon to govern the world and to prescribe to it imperishable laws. It is asserted that the art of preparing fish was one of the first boons of this powerful sovereign, and that, instructed by her, Thetis rendered Ichthyophagous the god of light and the fine arts. The Jews, an agricultural people living far from the borders of the sea, attached but very little importance to fishing and the researches necessarily attendant on it, so much so that we hardly perceive any trace among them of this kind of food, which Moses did not entirely interdict, since that wise legislator was satisfied with prohibiting fishes without scales or fins. What an immense wealth remained unexplored! Let us pity them for not having known how to profit by it, notwithstanding the goodwill of the Phoenicians, inhabitants of the coast, who brought them the produce of their maritime excursions. Let us say it. The Hebrews were tolerably bad cooks. They possessed most admirable laws, a fertile country, courage, and many virtues, but their sobriety would never allow them to understand the art of good living. In that they are to be pitied. We must agree that the Egyptians had better taste. Worshippers of certain fish, they used to embalm them as a means of preservation, and what is still better, they eat others in spite of the example of their priests, who never touched them. In fact, the preparation of those dishes required the trouble of a little study and culinary labor, therefore, to avoid it, they eat the fish raw when very hungry. The epicures dried them in the sun, and they were served salted on great solemnities. But it was left to a woman to understand this wholesome and delicate food, and to raise it to the rank it ought always to have occupied. Gatis, let her be named with admiration, Queen of Syria, and no doubt a beautiful woman, was so fond of fish that, in order to be continually supplied with the choicest quality, she ordered all caught in her kingdom to be brought to her, and that none shall be eaten without the royal permission. This law, for it really was one, created great dissatisfaction, but she very sensibly allowed them to complain, and continued to treat herself and those of her privileged subjects, whom she condescended sometimes to admit to her table, with the most exquisite dishes of fish, such as the tunny, conger eel, and carp. It is much to be regretted that the chroniclers of that time have forgotten to transmit to us the name of the cook of this illustrious queen, and the recipes of the sauces she preferred. With great pleasure we turn to the Greeks, that charming people who had only to set their foot on the most barren soil to cover it with flowers, and who laid the foundation of ichthyophagy as well as other sciences. It appears, however, that, at first, they thought but little of fish as an aliment. None had ever been served to the heroes of Homer and Ulysses. Relating that his hungry companions had partaken of some fish seems to excuse them by saying, hunger pressed their digestive organs. To be sure, a celebrated philosopher, and also an amiable Epicurean, attributed this grievous abstinence of those warriors to the fear of being enervated by dishes too delicious. And then, the terrible Achilles and the impetuous Ajax could not, perhaps, make up their minds to degustate under their tents a sole au gratin, or a fried herring, with the slow precaution more humble mortals willingly submit to. But shortly after that, fresh and salt fish became one of the principal articles of diet with the Hellenes. Aristophanes and the gastrophilist Athenus allude to it 100 times in their writings, and various personages are the subjects of biting sarcasms on account of their excessive partiality to the mullet, scar, and turbot. We may name, among others, Philoxenes of Cythera, who, learning from his doctor he was going to die of indigestion for having eaten too much of a most exquisite fish, "Be it so," he calmly exclaimed, "but, before I go, allow me to finish the remainder." Everyone knows the witty jokes of Lucian, who informs us that he knew a philosopher who examined with most serious comicality the nature of the soul of an oyster. Highly favoured by the neighbourhood of the sea, the Greek population applied themselves, with that particular taste which characterized them, to distinguish the best species, and skilful cooks knew how to give to fish the most refined flavour, thanks to the numerous combinations of ingredients which we too have learned from the ancient authors who have written on dietetics. They possess various ways of preparing them with salt or oil or aromatics. Athenus has transmitted to us some very important precepts upon their seasoning. Aeschylus and Sophocles were not above lowering their tragic muse by sometimes introducing remarks on fish sauce. The productions of the sea had for Athens such an irresistible interest that a law of police forbade all fishmongers to sit down until they had parted with the whole of their stock, so that the uncomfortable position of standing made them more submissive and induced them to dispose of the fish at a more reasonable price. This regulation in the Billingsgate of Athens was very rigorously observed, and the purchasers were highly delighted with it. They also required that the fish should always be out of the water, and this wise law consequently did not allow its being preserved or the price to be increased. And finally, as soon as any fish was brought to the market, they were required to call the customers together immediately by a kind of market bell, which was a sort of invitation to come and make their purchases. Some would-be philosophers, members of the opposition of that period, thought of raising their voices against common taste. Symmachus, Polycrates, and Lamprias tried to prove in their writings that those who eat fish were the most cruel and ferocious of men. These tender ichthyophilists were laughed at, and their works had no sale. The Romans inherited the predilection of the Greeks. For the dumb companions of the fair Amphitrite, but, excited by the love of the marvellous, they stocked the sea with imaginary beings, and they saw whales of 4 acres, fishes of 200 cubits, and even that eel or that serpent which veridical navigators have seen again in our days. It was then 30 feet in length, but now it is much longer. Pliny, who believed so many things, swore to these by the 12 great gods of Olympus. At all events, we are much indebted to that laborious naturalist for very precious information. He has made us acquainted with the scare, which the Roman epicures preferred to every other species. After the scare, the eel pout or lotus's liver enjoyed a great reputation. The red mullet, which is still much esteemed, was considered as one of the most delicate of dishes, and the Romans in fashionable circles employed it in a refinement of pleasure of a singular kind. It is well known that this fish, when the scales are removed, still remains a fine pink colour. The fops of Rome having remarked that, at death, this colour passed through a succession of the most beautiful shades, the poor mullet was served alive, enclosed in a glass vessel, and the guests, attentive and greedy of emotions, enjoyed this cruel spectacle, which presented to them a gradation of colours which insensibly disappeared. The greatest sensualists killed it in brine, and Apicius was the first who invented this kind of luxury. The brine most in use in such cases was made with the blood of mackerel, and that was one of the varieties of that famous garum, so highly praised by the Latin authors, and which was to them, at that period, what the fish sauces of the English are now. We will give in this work the various preparations of this so celebrated condiment, and the reader will then be able to judge for himself. Apicius, the man of culinary progress, proposed a prize to anyone who could invent a new brine made with the liver of red mullets. History has not transmitted to us the name of the fortunate conqueror, but Juvenal informs us that Asinius Celer offered 60 pounds for one of these fishes, which weighed 6 pounds. This was, after all, but a trifling folly, in the midst of so much extravagances which several writers have carefully registered. Lucullus, the most ostentatious of the patricians, had a mountain cut through the neighbourhood of Naples, so as to open a canal and bring up the sea and its fishes to the centre of the gardens of his sumptuous villa. The love of fish became a real mania. Turbots excited a furore of admiration. The Murrania Helena was worshipped. Hortensius, the orator, actually wept over the death of one he had fed with his own hands. The daughter of Drusus ornamented hers with golden rings. Each had a name, and would come with speed when it heard the voice of the master, whose happiness depended on his fish. Sometimes, in a moment of over-tenderness for his dear Murrania Helena, Vadius Pollio, a Roman knight of the highest distinction, and one of the intimate friends of the Emperor Augustus, could find nothing better to do than to feed them with the flesh of his slaves, who were thrown to them alive. It is true that these wretched creatures generally deserved this terrible chastisement. For instance, Seneca speaks of one who had the awkwardness to break a crystal vase while waiting at supper on the irascible Pollio. This unfortunate slave, having managed to escape from the hands of those who were conducting him to this horrible death, he went and fell on his knees at the feet of Caesar, whom he implored to inflict some less frightful torture. Augustus, moved to the very soul, granted him his liberty, had all of Vedius's vases broken, and ordered that the pieces should be used to fill up the reservoir in which the barbarous knight fed his Murrania Helena. Having given this rapid sketch of the principal periods of ichthyophagy among the ancients, little remains to be said of later ages in which we find few traces of any particular or excessive predilection of this kind of alimentation. If we are to believe Dio, the first inhabitants of Great Britain never eat fish. The English have not thought it expedient to imitate their ancestors in this respect. Under the reign of Edward II, certain fish, especially the sturgeon, never appeared in England except on the table of the king. It was prohibited to all others. In 1138, Stephen wanted to modify this interdiction, but after his reign it was again in vigour and considered as a royal prerogative. In France, anybody could eat fish, of any and all kinds, but every fishmonger was obliged to obtain permission from the king to sell it. The sumptuary laws of that kingdom inform us of nothing very interesting on this essential of gastrology. We find, however, by the edict of 1294, that Philippe le Bel allowed, on fast days, 2 herring pottages and only 1 sort of fish, a meagre dinner, if ever there was one, and which, thank heaven, has fallen into complete disuse. Louis XII was very fond of good cheer, and consequently he appointed 6 fishmongers to supply his table with freshwater fish. Francis I had 22, Henry the Great 24. Under the reign of Louis XIV, fish acquired a singular vogue in the city as well as at court, owing to the marvellous talent of that prince's cook, who discovered the art, supposed to be lost, of giving to the delicate flesh of the pike, the carp, and the trout, the shape and flavour of the most exquisite game. At this period, we have celebrated Vatel, one of the most illustrious officers of the household that ever flourished in the palace of the princes of Condé. This inimitable major domo understood that a dinner without fish was a cheerless one. One day, when his noble master entertained Louis XIV. At a royal banquet at Chantilly, which the genius of Vatel rendered more brilliant, the fish from the coast failed. He sent everywhere, but none could be found. He was completely bewildered. He met his august master, whose kind words, full of benevolence, only served to increase his desperation. He left him, ran to his chamber, took his sword, and 3 times pierced his heart. Shortly after, fish arrived from all quarters. Vatel was called. No Vatel. He was sought for, and at last discovered. Vatel was no more. It appears that, in former times, there was a remarkable consumption of fish in England on the 4th of July, the festival of St. Ulrich. The following verses by Barnaby Gouge prove it. St. Huldrych. Wheresoever Huldrych hath his place, the people there brings in, both capes and pikes and mullets fat, his favour here to win. Amid the church there sitteth one, and to the altar nigh, that selleth fish, and so good cheap, that every man may buy. Nor anything he loseth here, bestowing thus his pain, for when it hath been offered once, 'tis brought him all again. That twice or thrice he sells the same, ungodliness such gain, both still bring in, and plenteously the kitchen doth maintain. Whence comes the same religion new? What kind of God is this? Same Huldrych here, that so desires and so delights in fish. An ordinance of King John informs us that, in the 14th century, people eat porpoises and even seals. In the days of the troubadours, they fished for dolphins and whales in the Mediterranean, and the flesh of these sea monsters was considered excellent. Sturgeon. This enormous cartilaginous inhabitant of the ocean, the Mediterranean, the Red, Black, and Caspian seas, received from the Greeks after its death honours in which none of the most delicate or renowned fish participated. It was announced to the guests by the sound of trumpets, and slaves, magnificently dressed, placed it on the table in the midst of garlands and flowers. Joy brightened every face. A more generous wine filled fresh goblets, and some flatterers, for the sturgeon possessed many, with eyes fixed on the noble accipenser, compared its flesh to the ambrosia of the immortals. The high price of sturgeon contributed in no small degree to such brilliant praise. This king of banquets would have ruined a modest citizen of Athens, and hardly did the exiguity of its proportions to permit its figuring among the expensive rarities of an Attic supper, when it had cost only 1,000 drams, or about 16 pounds sterling. The Romans, imitators and emulators of the luxury of the Greeks, were almost equally fond of this fish, and, like them, reserved it for princely tables, or aristocratic opulence. It would seem, however, that the enthusiasm excited by the sturgeon somewhat cooled under the reign of Vespasian. Perhaps at this period it became more common, or was sold at a more moderate price. Nothing more was requisite in Rome to deprive a dish of its most brilliant vogue and most powerful patronage. However, the poet Martial, by nature no great flatterer, passes a pompous eulogium on the monstrous fish, and judges it worthy of being placed on the luxurious tables of the Palatine Mount, that West End of Rome, rendered illustrious by the presence of kings, nobles, and emperors. We have before observed that the sturgeon was formerly a royal dish in England. A celebrated traveller assures us that, at the present day, the Chinese abstain from it, and the sovereign of the Celestial Empire consigns it to his own kitchens, or dispenses it to a few of his greatest favourites. This gigantic accipenser, which often weighs 200 pounds, is quite common in Siberia, where they even catch some of a much larger size, since some of the females have been found to contain 200 pounds weight of eggs. In 1750, one was caught in Italy which weighed 550 pounds. There are some in Norway, the head alone of which yields a ton of oil, and whose immense proportions would formerly have astounded the most intrepid gastrophilists of Athens, Syracuse, and Rome. An alimentary substance called caviar, furnished almost exclusively by Russia to the rest of Europe, is prepared from the spawn of several kinds of sturgeons. The spawn of the large sturgeon produces caviar of an inferior quality. That of the common sturgeon and the sterlet is prized as being more delicate, when it is carefully separated from the vessels and membranes with which it is intersected, well impregnated with brine, pressed and slightly dried. White caviar, it is said, is the best of all. It is reserved for the court. There are two sorts of caviar, granulated caviar and sack caviar. The manufacture of the first named is performed by pressing the spawn on a sieve and rubbing it in every direction to remove the pellicles which adhere to it, after which it is put into strong brine for 1 hour, then drained in a sieve, and finally pressed close into barrels so as to entirely fill them before the head is fastened down. The manufacture of the other kind of caviar only differs in two particulars. The spawn is manipulated while in the brine in order to soften it, and is put, in small portions of about ½ pound each, into linen bags, which are powerfully twisted to extract all the brine before it is pressed into the barrels. The workmen employed in these operations make a third kind of caviar with the refuse. This sort, used only by the poorest classes, deserves no notice. For some years past, they have introduced the method of salting the roes as they are taken from the fish and packing them into barrels, where they remain 7 or 8 months, after which they are again salted and then dried in the sun. Caviar occupies a very distinguished place in Russian, Turkish, German, and Italian gastronomy. The Greeks in particular live upon it almost exclusively during the long Lent fasts prescribed by their church. Red mullet. Philoxenes of Cythera supped one night with Dionysius, tyrant of Sicily. It happened that the prince was served with a magnificent mullet, whereas a very small one was presented to his guest. The philosopher took his fish in his hand, and, with a very serious air, held it to his ear. Dionysius asked him what he was doing. "I am busy with my Galathea," replied Philoxenes, "and I am questioning him on the subject of Nerea, but I can obtain no answer from him because he was taken at too early an age. I am certain, however, that the other, evidently much older, which lies before you, is perfectly well acquainted with what I wish to know." The tyrant, who happened that evening to be in a good humour, laughed at the joke, and offered the larger mullet to the witty gastronomist. The unbridled and cruel luxury of ancient Rome required that this fish should be cooked by a slow fire, on the table and under a glass, that the guests might gloat on its sufferings before they satiated their appetites with its flesh. It is true that this barbarous gratification was very expensive, and it was necessary to be very rich to indulge in it. Consequently, it was decidedly very fashionable, quite natural, and in the very best taste. Ordinary mullets weighed about 2 pounds. These hardly deserved that their dying agonies should for an instant amuse the guests. They were worth only about 15 pounds or 20 pounds each. But sometimes fortune threw their way much larger ones, and the opulent amateur esteemed himself only too fortunate when he could obtain a fish of 3 or 4 pounds for a much higher sum than he had paid for the slave, tutor of his children. Crispinus was fond of mullets. He obtained one weighing 4 or 6 pounds, for which the fishmonger asked only 60 pounds. This was giving it away, and certainly the man did not understand his trade. Crispinus, on becoming the possessor of this wonderful treasure, was astonished at his good fortune, and the whole of Rome long refused to believe it. In the reign of Tiberius, 3 of these fish were sold for 30,000 sesterces, or £209, and this emperor was one day generous enough to give up to P. Octavius for the low price of 5,000 sesterces, a very fine mullet which had just been presented to him. And yet some persons of culinary authority paid but little attention to the flesh of this delicate fish. They sought only the liver and the head, and if they paid for it so dearly, it was solely to find some few mouthfuls more than these 2 parts. To which caprice, enthusiasm, that fever of admiration, and we know not what extraordinary gastronomic rage gave an inestimable price, which at the present day excites only a smile of incredulity. Pliny speaks of a mullet caught in the Red Sea, which weighed 80 pounds. At how much, adds this great naturalist, would it have been valued had they caught it in the environs of Rome? We may suppose, without the least exaggeration, that many a senator would have offered 1,500 pounds to become its possessor. It is thus that the mistress of the world foolishly dissipated in ephemeral whims the immense treasures poured into her lap by tributary kings, conquered and spoliated nations. Each day her patricians, knights, and nobles, tired of their importunate opulence, solicited new diversions and invented new excesses. The mullet, for a moment, satisfied their prodigality, and amused their barbarity. But Heliogabalus appeared, and he imagined prodigies of gluttony which excited at once admiration and envy. The liver of this fish appeared to him too paltry. He took it into his head to be served with large dishes completely filled with the gills. Now we know that the mullet possesses only 2. This dish, whose price would have enriched 100 families, was worthy of the Sardanapalus of Rome, who at the age of 18 had exhausted the treasures of the empire, and whom a violent death seized most apropos, at the moment when he had attained the extreme limits of crime and infamy. The Romans served the mullet with a seasoning of pepper, rue, onions, dates, and mustard, to which they added the flesh of the sea hedgehog, reduced to a pulp, and oil. When the liver alone was to be eaten, it was cooked, and then seasoned with pepper, salt, or a little garum. Some oil was added, and hare's or fowl's liver, and then oil was poured over the whole. The Greeks knew how to appreciate the mullet. They thought highly of those who caught on their own shores, and placed them in the first rank of the most exquisite dishes of their delicate cookery. It is with the eggs of mullets, when salted, pressed, washed, and dried, that the preparation known as botargo or botarcha is made. It is very recherché in Italy and other southern countries as a seasoning. Dr. Cloquet. Sea eel. The sumptuous abode of L. Crassus echoes with his sighs and groans. His children and slaves respect his profound sorrow and leave him with intelligent affection to solitude. That friend of great grief, so grateful to the afflicted soul because tears can flow unwitnessed. Alas, the favourite sea eel of Crassus is dead, and it is uncertain whether Crassus can survive it. This sensitive Roman caused his beloved fish to be buried with great magnificence. He raised a monument to its memory, and never ceased to mourn for it. This man, who displayed so little tenderness towards his servants, had extraordinary weakness concerning his fine sea eels. He passed his life beside the superb fish pond, where he lovingly fattened them from his own hand. Ornamented with necklaces of the finest pearls, and earrings of precious stones, all, at signal, swam towards him. Several fearlessly took the food he offered them, and some, as familiar as their absent and regretted companion, allowed their master to caress them without seeking to bite or avoid him. This singular passion, which at the present day we can hardly believe, in spite of the respectable authority of most serious writers, was very common at Rome, amongst those who were rich enough to rear such fish. C. Hirtius was the first to construct fish ponds on the seashore, to which many visitors were attracted by their magnificence. The family of Licinius took their surname of Murena from these fish, in order thus to perpetuate the most silly affection, and the remembrance of their insanity. Sea eels necessarily pleased men cloyed with pleasures, and who substituted a kind of cold and cruel curiosity for the terrible emotions which beings peculiarly organized hope to find in evil-doing. Gladiators murdering each other, lions or tigers lacerating the bestiary, all these agonies of the amphitheatre had long since lost the attraction of novelty. It was a much more exciting spectacle to witness a swarm of sea eels tearing to pieces an awkward or rebellious slave. Besides, it greatly improved the fish. The atrocious Vidius Pollio, who understood these matters, never failed to have sea eels served him after their odious repast, that he might have the pleasure of eating some part of the body of his victim. Thank heaven, however, some amateurs of this dreaded fish were not so barbarous. They fattened them very well without having recourse to such criminal food. Veal was cut into thin slices and steeped in the blood of the animal for 10 days, after which the fish greedily regaled themselves with it. It was, doubtless, in this manner that the skilful speculator, Hirtius, the same already mentioned, nourished his sea eels, which produced him an immense revenue. His fish ponds contained so great a number that he was able to offer 6,000 to Julius Caesar on the occasion of the public feast that general gave the day of his triumphal return from the conquest of Gaul. The greater part of the Roman emperors were exceedingly fond of sea eels. The greedy Vitellius, growing tired of this dish, would at last only eat the soft roes, and numerous vessels ploughed the seas in order to obtain them for him. This exquisite rarity again appeared too common to the maniac child, who dismayed and astonished Rome for the space of 3 years. Heliogabalus brought the soft roe of the sea eel into disrepute by ordering that the peasants of the Mediterranean should be gorged with it. This folly amused him, and only cost several millions. That was a trifle when compared to the blood which almost always flowed to satisfy his whims. The Greeks and Latins thought much of the sea eels caught in the Straits of Sicily. They were sometimes served surrounded with crawfish, but more frequently they were dressed with a seasoning much in fashion, composed of pepper, alisander, savory, saffron, onion, and stoned Damascus plums. These various substances were mixed together, and to them were added wine, sweet sun-made wine, old wine reduced by boiling, garum, vinegar, and oil. At Rome, the fish market was abundantly supplied with sea eels from the Tiber. Connoisseurs thought nothing of them. They were sold at a low price, and their disgrace became complete directly they appeared on plebeian tables. The Egyptians venerated this fish and always esteemed it sacred. Among the Sybarites, just appreciators of its culinary qualities, the fishers and sellers of sea eels were exempt from all taxes. They often procured some of such enormous size that we should be tempted to accuse the old chroniclers of exaggeration, if we were not aware that this animal attains considerable dimensions. In the year 1786, a sea eel was taken in the Elbe, weighing 60 pounds. This extraordinary fish measured 7 feet 2 inches in length, and 25 inches in the girth. Lamprey. In spite of its soft and viscid flesh, this fish occupied in Rome a most honourable rank among the multitudinous dishes which intemperance was ever augmenting, and preference was given to that species caught by the enterprising speculators in that strait which separates Sicily from Italy. These good people averred that lampreys which rise to the surface of the sea are immediately dried up by the sun, and cannot any more descend to the depths of the ocean. This little story did no harm to their sale. On the contrary, they became on that account more curiously interesting. It was also said, and the serious Gesner himself has repeated this fable, that if the fish fastens its mouth to the side of a vessel, it immediately stops, and that the combined power of the wind and the efforts of the rowers are unavailing. The fact is, by means of a kind of suction, it can fasten firmly on any bodies, and one weighing only 3 pounds has been seen to sustain in the air, with its mouth, a stone weighing 12 pounds. The lamprey has not always been the fashion, but it has had brilliant and glorious epochs. In 1135 it caused so great a fit of indigestion to Henry I, King of England, that prince died in consequence of it. Since then, in the 16th century, it has been honoured with the reputation of having caused more than one death. It was sold at a very high price, 3 pounds at least, and at certain periods the Roman nobles even paid as much as 20 pounds for one of these fish. The ancient metropolis of the world had sometimes strange reminiscences of her former grandeur. The Italian epicures of that remarkable era used to kill the lamprey in Candian wine. A nutmeg was placed in the mouth, and a clove in each of the openings of the gills. They rolled them around in a saucepan, and after adding crushed almonds, breadcrumbs, Candian wine, and spices, the whole was cooked over a slow fire. Sea wolf. Hicesius, one of the most estimable ichthyophagists of antiquity, does not hesitate to place the sea wolf above all the fish which by their excellence were dear to Greece, and the great Archestratus says that the lubridan, a species of the sea wolf, is a child of the gods. The Romans, touched no doubt by these magnificent praises, granted to the sea wolf that favour which a high reputation commands. The immense sturgeon itself was eclipsed by it, and the sea wolf had the glory of throwing this powerful and renowned rival into oblivion. Their love for its white and tender flesh knew no bounds, and the fishermen of the Tiber were no longer equal to the task of supplying them for the impatient gluttony of the rich inhabitants of the Palatine mountain. Still, this fish only fetched a high price when taken in certain part of the river. From any other place it hardly commanded a few pence. Between the Sublicius and the Sanatorius bridges, a deep, black, and fetid water announced the presence of the continual flood of filth which the giant city poured into it night and day. It was in the midst of these impurities that shoals of sea wolves were seen disporting. They fattened on that shocking slime, and thence passed to the delicate tables of Lucullus and Caesar. The Greeks contented themselves with the lubridans taken in clear water, and preferred the head to any other part. Scarus, or parrotfish. The scarus, its modern name is still problematic, furnished the Greeks with one of those exquisite dishes the remembrance of which never dies. The Romans were not yet acquainted with it when Octavius, the commander of a fleet, brought on board the vessels a great quantity of this fish, which he ordered to be thrown into the sea along the coast of Campania, and which soon became the delight of the epicures of Rome. History has shown too much disdain by neglecting to say more than a few passing words on the subject of this great service. May a tardy homage of gratitude be paid to the memory of the benefactor of his country. The scarus was prepared without being emboweled, and epicures found it impossible to satiate themselves with the entrails, which obtained for it a gastronomic vogue it long enjoyed without a rival. It was asserted that the fish ruminates, that it feeds only on herbage, and that, far from being mute like the other inhabitants of the water, it not only emits sounds, but is able to express by its cries the different sensations it experiences. These anomalies, either real or supposed, had, perhaps, as great a share in rendering the scarus celebrated as the delicacy of its flesh and the exquisite flavour of its intestines. Merit the most real can so rarely keep the field unsupported by cajolery. Turbot. Rome and Italy were indebted to the praetor Sempronius, or to Rufus Rutilius, for the turbot, which they taught their countrymen to appreciate. This fish quickly obtained the success which it merited, and was compared to the pheasant, as soles were likened to partridges, lampreys to quails, and sturgeons to peacocks. Some preferred turbot from the Adriatic Sea, others that of Ravenna, but all united in declaring that there was not a more delicious food, and that a feast loses all of its charm when this delicacy is wanting. In the reign of Domitian, a monstrous turbot was taken. Such a one had never been seen in the imperial kitchens. The emperor convoked the Senate, and deferred to them to decide in what dish it should be cooked, in order that it might be served whole. The deliberation was long and stormy. All Rome was in a state of expectancy, and the august assembly strove to prove itself worthy of the high confidence reposed in it by Caesar. At length the illustrious old men were tolerably unanimous in their idea that the best way would be to make a dish expressly for the fish, since there was none large enough ready-made, and also that a stove should be constructed vast enough to allow the dish to be placed commodiously upon it. The emperor, the city, and the court applauded the profound wisdom of this decision, and le turbot fut mis à la sauce piquante. Aristotle does not mention this fish, but his compatriots esteemed highly the turbots of Attica. Tunny. The Greeks greatly praised the tunny fish of Pacanum. Persons who prided themselves on their knowledge in the art of good living eat only the belly part, and never touched the remainder. The Sinopians formerly gained immense sums by the tunny fishery along their shores, the effigy of which, perhaps in gratitude, they stamped on their money. This fish came from Pallas Meotides, and passed thence to Trebizond and Pharnacia, whence it followed the coast of Sinopus, and at length reached Byzantium, where they took nearly all those which escaped the fisheries of the two first named stations. The Romans offered tunny fish in sacrifice to Neptune, in order that that god might deign to prevent the Xiphias fish from tearing their nets, and forbid the too officious dolphins to assist in their escape. They sold it at a very good price during the autumn and winter, but it fetched less in the summer, because it was thought to be unwholesome during that season. The jowl and belly were thought the most delicate parts. They were either fried or boiled with pepper, alisander, cumin, onion, mint, sage, and dates, to which was added a mixture of honey, vinegar, oil, and mustard. Archestratus, who, on account of his gastronomic voyages, was looked upon as a high authority, asserts that Sicily and the neighbourhood of Constantinople furnished excellent tunny fish, but that the best were those from Samos. These latter were much renowned among the Greeks, who carefully prepared the entrails and feasted on this dish. Athenus relates on the subject a witticism of the poet Dorio, a keen and caustic spirit of the period of Aristotle and Philip of Macedon. Being at supper with that prince, a guest ridiculously praised a dish of tunny fish intestines, just placed on the table. "They are certainly excellent," said Dorio, "when eaten as I eat them." "How then do you eat them?" rejoined the gastronomic courtier. "With the firm determination," replied the poet, "of thinking of nothing better." The fish abounds in certain seas, and Pliny avers that it obstructed the navigation of the Indian Sea to such an extent that the fleet of Alexander the Great was obliged to change its course in order to avoid this impassable barrier. Tunny fish sometimes attain an immense size. Father Sati tells us that some were caught in Sardinia weighing no less than 1,000 pounds, and sometimes even 1,800 pounds. Conger eel. Near Sicyona, a city of the Peloponnesus, they formerly caught conger eels of such immense size that it required a wagon drawn by oxen to carry a single one. The body, the whole of the head, and even the intestines, were eaten. This dish, worthy of being offered by Neptune to his divine colleagues, was capable, like ambrosia, of bestowing immortality on those who had the good fortune of tasting it, and the dead would return to life, had it been possible to serve them with a piece of this exquisite fish. These childish exaggerations have not prevented Galen from treating the conger eel with very little respect. He affirms that nothing is more hard or indigestible, and indeed Epicureans of some repute allowed only the head to appear on their tables, and then only at rare intervals. and under the auspices of a relishing sauce which assured its reception. The Romans had still less esteem for this too highly praised fish. However, sometimes a fried conger eel occupied on the sigma an obscure place, in the midst of a seasoning flavoured highly with pepper, alisander, cumin, wild marjoram, dried onion, and the hard yolks of eggs, with which a skilful hand carefully mixed to the whole vinegar, sweet wine, garum, and cooked wine. Eel. In some parts of Egypt the eel was not eaten because it was thought indigestible. In other places it received religious worship. They were ornamented, whether they liked it or not, with silver, gold, and precious stones, and priests daily offered them the entrails of animals and cheese. The Greeks thought highly of eels. "Behold the Helen of feasts!" cried Oedicastes at the moment when one was served. "I will be her Paris." And the glutton seized and devoured it immediately. Boeotia, where this fish was immolated to the gods, the Straits of Sicily, and the Copian Lake furnished eels remarkable for their delicacy and size. These were served fried and enveloped in beet leaves. They enjoyed a high reputation among the Sybarites, a choice nation, who would have invented cookery if the art had not already existed, and among whom a repast was so serious a matter that a whole year was not thought too long in order to meditate upon it and get it ready. But Hippocrates did not like the eel, and he forbade it to his patients, and to persons attacked with a pulmonary affection, so that this queen of luxury, as Archestratus calls it, met with as many enemies as partisans. Egypt adored it, Greece was enamoured of it, Rome despised it, and the plebeian alone reserved it to the humiliation in his brutal orgies. Apicius, however, has condescended to notice this fish. "Mix," says he, "pepper, alisander, parsley seed, dill, and dates. Add to this honey, vinegar, garum, oil, mustard, and cooked wine. Serve this sauce with the eel." Nations have their ages of splendour. Viands have their epochs of celebrity and glory. This one seems to us fast falling into decay, in spite of some isolated efforts in order to make it flourish. When Rockingham was named Member of Parliament, he ordered 13 barrels of eels to be brought to London, for the banquet he gave on that occasion. No one to our knowledge has since prepared so gigantic a matelote. Travellers formerly saw in the Ganges beautiful eels 300 feet long, a magnificent species never seen in Europe. The eel, so much despised by the Romans, is rather in favour in several countries. Certain species are much esteemed. That named Gousseau, among others, deserves the preference it always obtains in Rouen. Pike. The pike was very little esteemed by ancient gastronomists, who viewed it only as an ignoble inhabitant of muddy water, and the implacable enemy of frogs. It was received opinion that this despotic ruler of ponds lived for several centuries, and it may be correct. Among the examples of longevity of this fish, the most remarkable is that of the pike of Kaiser's lantern, which was 19 feet long, weighed 350 pounds, and lived at least 235 years. It is reported that the Emperor Barbossa himself threw it, on the 5th of October, 1262, into the pond where it was caught in 1497, and that this enormous pike wore a golden ring, which was made so that it would expand, and on which was engraved the date when the fish was spawned. Its skeleton was for a long time preserved at Mannheim. The multiplication of pikes would be immense if the spawn and pickerel, in the first year of their existence, were not the prey of several other fishes, for it has been calculated that in a female pike of middling size, 184,000 eggs were found. In the north, and particularly in Siberia, the pike is preserved, salted, and smoked. The largest only are used, those weighing about 2 pounds. When they have been drawn, cleaned, and washed, they are cut in pieces, stratified with salt in barrels. A brine is formed in which they are left for 3 days, then they are dried or smoked for 1 month. After this time, they are put in another barrel with fresh salt, wetted with vinegar. Carp. The carp occupied a very honourable rank with the Greeks and Latins, but only as a fish of that second order. At Athens they picked out the bones and stuffed it with silphium, cheese, salt, and marjoram. The Romans boiled it and mixed it with sow's paps, fowl's flesh, fig peckers, or thrushes, and when the whole was made into a kind of pulp, they added raw eggs and oil. Then they sprinkled it over with pepper and alisander, after which they poured wine, garum, and cooked wine over it, and when the culinary combination was completed in the stewpan, by the assistance of a slow fire, it was then thickened with flour. In several countries it is known at what period the carp was naturalized. Peter Marshall brought it to England in 1514, Peter Ox to Denmark in 1560. A few years after, it was introduced into Holland and Sweden. The fecundity of this fish is surprising. No less than 621,600 eggs were found in a carp weighing 9 pounds, and it is very long-lived. Several have been seen in the moats of the castle on Pontchartrain, which were proved to be 150 years old. Carp are capable of acquiring considerable dimensions. The most gigantic on record was that caught at Bischofshaus, near Frankfurt, on the Oder. It weighed 70 pounds. Eel pout. The liver of the eel pout, also known by the names lota, lote, and lotus, is particularly large, and so delicate that a certain Countess of Buchlingen squandered a large portion of her income to gratify her taste for them. That lady, worthy by her refined and antique taste of the proudest period of Roman extravagance, was, perhaps, not aware that the most fastidious Epicureans of Italy, enthusiastic admirers of the liver of this fish, had it served with a sauce composed of vinegar, grated cheese, and garlic, to which they added leeks and onions, chopped fine. Trout. Ælian speaks of a fish found in the river Astraeus in Macedonia, which Gesner believed to be identical with the trout. It does not appear, however, that the Greeks knew the real value and merit of this fish, but on the other hand, the Romans assigned it to the foremost rank, next to the sturgeon, red mullets, and the sea eel, especially when they had been fattened to the thick waters of the Tiber, on the very spot where the Labridans acquired their plumpness and value. The trout was dressed like the preceding fish. Goldfish. This fish, dear to the Greeks, had the honour of giving its name to the celebrated ichthyophagist, Sergius, who was passionately fond of it, and who took the name Orata from Orata goldfish, to preserve in his family the remembrance of his gluttony or his affection. His compatriots, the Romans, highly valued the goldfish, and sought with eagerness those which had fed on the shellfish of the lake of Lucrin, that precious reservoir between Baiae and Cumae, which never deceived the hopes of the gastronomist nor the greedy expectations of the fisherman. The goldfish was served with a gravy composed of pepper, alisander, carrots, wild marjoram, rue, mint, myrtle leaves, and the yolks of eggs, mixed with honey, vinegar, oil, wine, and garum. The slow cooking of these various ingredients gave them the required homogeneousness. End of section 22. Recording by Corinne LePage. Section 23 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corinne LePage. Pantropheon by Alexis Soyer. Fish, Part 2. Whiting. The flesh of this gadou is so light that, according to an old French proverb, the merlan mangé ne pèse non plus dans l'estomac que pendu à la ceinture. Whitings weigh no more when eaten than when hung to the girdle. Nevertheless, the Greeks did not think much of it, and they said that the whiting was only good for those who could not obtain more delicate fish. The Romans, less severe or not quite so particular, cooked their whitings with a sauce composed as follows. Put with the fish in a stewpan some garum, chopped leeks, cumin, savory, and a sufficient quantity of cooked wine, and some wine slightly diluted. Cook it on a slow fire. Codfish. The codfish supplied the ancients with the most exquisite dish next to the sturgeon. The only fault found with it was that it cost less than others. The Greek cooks sprinkled it with grated cheese, moistened with vinegar, then they threw over it a pinch of salt and a few drops of oil. Persons with delicate stomachs did not scruple to partake of this aliment, which Galen warranted as being excellent. The average size of this fish is about 3 feet in length, but some are found of 10 feet. The common weight is 15 pounds, and some have been seen weighing 60 pounds. Leeuwenhoek has said that 9,344,000 eggs had been found in one fish. It is probable that he made a mistake, as a codfish of our days weighing 50 pounds produced only 3,686,000 eggs, a number sufficiently prodigious, and which shows pretty well its great fecundity. It is supposed that the discovery of the great and small banks of codfish is due to the Basque fishermen, who arrived there in pursuit of whales 100 years before Columbus's voyage. Others give that honour to James Cartier, a native of Falkland Islands. As early as the 14th century, the English and the inhabitants of Amsterdam busied themselves with cod fishing, and later the Irish, Norwegians, French, and Spaniards competed with them more or less successfully. In 1533, Francis I, having sent J. Verrazzano and afterwards Jacques Cartier to explore the neighbourhood of Newfoundland, the French fishermen followed them and brought back also this fish from those distant countries in the beginning of the 16th century. Man annually seizes upon a prodigious quantity of cods, and were it not for the immense extent of the means of reproduction allowed to it by nature, the species for a long time past would have been annihilated. It is even hardly conceived how it has been possible to preserve it, for it is well known that as early as 1368 the inhabitants of Amsterdam had brought up fishermen on the coast of Sweden, and in the first quarter of 1792, according to a report presented to the minister, Roland, at the National Convention, that from the ports of France only 210 vessels, forming together 191,158 tons, went out for the cod fisheries, and that every year more than 10,000 vessels of all nations employed at this trade throw in the commercial world more than 40 million of salted and dried cod. If we add to this enumeration the havoc made among the legions of these fishes by the great squales, sharks, and others, besides the destruction of a multitude of young ones by the other inhabitants of the seas and sea birds, together with the myriads of eggs destroyed by accident, it really is extraordinary to see this fish in so great a quantity now. But who can wonder, since each female can every year give birth to more than 9 million of young ones? Dr. Cloquet. Perch. The Greeks were acquainted with the perch. Diocles used to give the flesh to the sick, Xenocrates extolled those from the Rhine, and Ausonius, the poet, has sung the praises of those fed in Moselle. With the Romans, this fish obtained a renown almost equal to that bestowed on the trout, and all eyes bespoke its welcome at supper, when it appeared on the table covered with a seasoning in which pepper, alisander, cumin, and onions were artistically combined with stoned Damascus plums. Thanks to the clever use of wine, vinegar, sweet wine, oil, and cooked wine, this ingenious amalgamation acquired over a slow fire the requisite consistence and cohesion. Skate. The ancients liked or disliked skate according to the places where they eat it. So now this fish is rejected in Sardinia, and thought excellent in London and Paris. The Greek gastronomists of fashion sometimes partook of the back of the skate. The remainder seemed unworthy of their attention, and a certain poet maintains that a piece of stuff, boiled, offers to the palate a flavour quite as agreeable. Italian gluttony always gave a cold reception to this dish, which they owed to the Greek cooks, which their magiric writers have not sufficiently studied. Aristotle knew of 2 species of skate. Pliny speaks of them. Lacépède enumerates 39 species. That celebrated naturalist, Buffon's pupil and competitor, assures us that several Eastern nations consider the smoke arising from the eggs of skates, thrown on burning coals and inhaled by the mouth and nostrils, as an excellent remedy against intermittent fever. It would cost but little to make the experiment. Salmon. It is reported that the salmon was thus named on account of its frequent leaping. It has been sung by Ausonius. Its absence left a chasm in the delights of Greece, and it was late before it became known in Rome. Pliny is the first of Latin authors who name it. Ichthyophagy will cherish the memory of this laborious author. He speaks with praise of the salmon taken in the Garonne and Dordogne. He extols those of Rhine, but he seems to give a decided preference to those magnificent fishes, covered with a silvery mail, which disport in the limpid waters of that picturesque and beautiful Aquitaine. 2 centuries ago there was such a great quantity of salmon taken in the rivers of Scotland that, instead of being considered a delicate dish, it served commonly as food for servants, who it is said stipulated sometimes that they should not be obliged to eat that common tasteless aliment more than 5 times per week. Sepia, or cuttlefish. Pliny has extolled the consistency of conjugal affection in the cuttlefish, and the courage with which the male defends his companion in the moment of danger. The poet Persius describes its flight, protected by the thick black liquid with which it blinds its enemies. Apicius, struck more by its succulent qualities, opens this fish, empties it, and stuffs it with cooked brains, to which he adds raw eggs and pepper. He then boils it in a seasoning of pepper, alisander, parsley seed, and cooked wine, mixed with honey, wine, and garum. Thus prepared, the cuttlefish passed at Rome as an estimable dish, and which might be offered at an unpretending repast. Swordfish. The Greeks were fond of the swordfish, and often partook of it with a sauce of which oil was the basis, and with which were mixed yolks of eggs, leeks, garlic, and cheese. The Romans thought very little of this fish, and prayed Neptune to send it far from their nets. Shad. The shad was caught during the summer, and sold to the people, who boiled it and dished it up with strong herbs and oil. This plebeian fish was excluded from all respectable banquets. Modern taste has allowed this estimable fish to reappear on the table, where it is always seen with pleasure. This fish caught in most of the great rivers of Europe, Asia, and northern Africa. Bosc. Rhombo, or rhombus. The rhombo claimed the attention of the discriminating ichthyophagists of Rome by the delicacy of its flesh, and few fish would have been preferred to it had it not been feared that it rendered digestion difficult. Some intrepid stomachs, however, greeted this dish without much repugnance when presented to them fried and sprinkled with pepper, in the midst of a seasoning in which pepper, cumin, coriander, benzoin, wild marjoram, and rue, heightened by a little vinegar, were mixed with dates, honey, cooked wine, and oil. This boiling sauce was poured over the rhombo, but not before it had been enriched with garum, which we had almost forgotten, that inevitable brine which the ancient magiric genius placed everywhere, and whose prodigious renown ought to have preserved it from oblivion. Mugill. This fish, singular instrument of a punishment invented by Rome, entered into the bill of fare of a fashionable supper, but one without that magnificence which a feast of parade exacts. It was prepared with pepper, alisander, cumin, onion, mint, rue, sage, and dates, mixed with honey, vinegar, mustard, and oil. The Greeks also esteemed mugills, and gave preference to those sold by the fishermen of Sciathus. Mackerel. Commentators do not agree on the origin of this word. Scaliger, who perceived Greek in everything, says it is derived from makarios, happy. But then, in what does the facility of this fish consist? The old writer Ballon, more wise in his conjecture, thinks this word comes from the Latin macularelli, little spots, because it is marked on the back with black stripes. Let the etymology be what it may, the Epicurean cares very little about it. Mackerel was much liked in Greece, where it was believed to be a native of the Hellespont, and throughout Italy, where it was supposed to have come originally from Spain. It is very probable that from the mackerel was obtained one of the varieties of garum, known by the name of garum sociorum. Further on, we intend to devote a special chapter to the subject of this celebrated condiment. Neither the size nor the weapons of mackerel make them formidable. They have, however, a violent appetite, and on account, perhaps, of the confidence they feel in the number of each shoal, they are bold and voracious, frequently attack fishes larger and stronger than themselves, and even dart with blind audacity upon the fishermen who bathe where they happen to be. Thus Pantropheon relates that a sailor bathing in the port of Carcool, in Norway, missing one of his companions, saw him a few minutes afterwards dead, the body mangled and covered with a multitude of mackerel, tearing his remains to pieces. Dr. Cloquet. Haddock. The haddock, like the sturgeon, was surrounded with the ridiculous honours of almost divine pomp. It was served interwoven with garlands, and trumpeters accompanied the slaves who, with uncovered heads and foreheads crowned with flowers, brought the guests this dish, the merit of which was perhaps exaggerated by capricious fancies. Tench. Ausonius, who lived in the 4th century of the Christian era, is the first who has spoken of the tench, in his poem of the Mostella. It was abandoned to the common people, who alone feasted on it. This fish, long the victim of an unjust disdain, ultimately conquered from the great esteem which they at first refused to it. Dragon weaver. The dragon weaver traversed unseen the long and brilliant gastronomic period of the Romans. Greece rendered it more justice, but its too modest qualities were not able to preserve it from forgetfulness and indifference. Loligo. At Rome, the loligo, a species of cuttlefish, was sometimes served with pepper and rue, mixed with garum, honey, sweet wine boiled, and a few drops of oil. Sole. This fish, which the Greeks caught on the coast, was much sought after on account of the delicacy of its nourishing and light flesh. The flounder, the brill, the diamond, and the Dutch plaice, which together with the sole were known under the general name of passers, enjoyed an equal esteem, and had attributed to them the same qualities. Angelfish. In Holland there are angelfish of enormous size, and Aldro van Doos relates that some have been seen which weighed as much as 160 pounds. In the time of this naturalist the common people did not eat them very willingly. Filefish. The flesh of this species of the Bolistes is only good when fried, according to Margrave. Columella thinks as much of it, and Pliny ranks it among the saxatiles, the most esteemed by connoisseurs. Pilchard. Among the Greeks, this fish was considered only as fit for the people. Those from the environs of the Phaleres were much esteemed, when left only an instant in boiling oil. The Romans, who gave them the first rank among the salt fish, stuffed them, in order to render them better, in the following manner. They bruised the pennyroyal, cumin, pepper, mint, and pine nuts. These they mixed with honey, and with this paste they filled the anchovy after having carefully boned them. They then wrapped them in paper, and cooked them in bain-marie, or saucepan, immersed in boiling water. They were served with oil, dregs of fish brine, and cooked wine. Loach. The Greeks liked loaches, but many abstained from eating them lest the Syrian goddess, the protectress of these fishes, should gnaw their legs, cover their bodies with ulcers, and devour their liver. The inhabitants of Italy, free from this singular superstition, cleaned the loaches, left them some time in oil, then placed them in a saucepan, with some more oil, garum, wine, and several bunches of rue and wild marjoram. Then these bunches were thrown away, and the fish was sprinkled with pepper at the moment of serving. Gudgeon. The gudgeon, thought excellent by every one, but which no one mentions, appeared with honour in the most magnificent repasts at Athens. At Rome it was served fried at the beginning of supper, and it disposed the guests to attack boldly the culinary corps de réserve, which took up the position as soon as the skirmish with the gudgeon was over. This fish is in abundance, principally in France and Germany. It is very good and easily digested. They are served either fried or stewed. When done as last mentioned, they must be drawn and wiped dry, put in a flat stewpan with butter, salt, pepper, good red wine, spring onions, mushrooms, shallots, thyme, bay leaves, and basil. These last plants chopped very fine, stew the whole a quarter of an hour, and serve. Bosc. Herring. Herrings were known in Greece and Rome. Bosc says it is a manna that nature doubtless reserves for the northern nations, which they, however, have only turned to account in modern times. The first herring fishery known in Europe was on the coast of Scotland, but that nation knew not how to profit by the treasure that the sea offered them. All the Scotch historians mention this fishery, the produce of which was bought by the Dutch. This transaction took place under the reign of King Alfred, about the year 836. After some time the Scotch quarrelled with the Dutch, who undertook the herring fishery themselves. As they caught a great many more than they could consume, they salted them and sold them in foreign countries. Such was the origin of that immense commerce, which had its rise, according to Adis, about the year 1320, a short time after the Teutons had established themselves in the Baltic. It is said that we owe the art of salting and barreling herrings to a Dutch fisherman named William Beukels, who died in 1449. The Dutch nation raised a mausoleum to his memory, and it is asserted that Charles V, who visited it in 1536, ate a herring upon it to render homage to the author of a precious discovery. In the year 1610, Sir Walter Raleigh gave a statistical account of the commerce carried on by the Dutch in Russia, Germany, Flanders, and France, with the herrings caught on the coast of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The sale of this fish amounted in 1 year to the sum of £2,650,000. It has been erroneously thought that the herring was the helek or alec of the Romans. This name was given by them to a kind of brine. It was not the name of any particular fish. There are two prevalent methods of preserving herrings, and fishmongers sell them under the denominations of salted herrings and red herrings. The process employed for the first named is as follows. As soon as the herring is out of the sea, a sailor opens it, removes the gills and the entrails, washes the fish in salt water, and puts it into a brine thick enough for it to float. After 15 or 18 hours it is taken out of the brine and laid in a tub with a quantity of salt. It remains in this tub until the port is reached. There the herrings are placed in barrels, where they are artistically arranged one over another, with fresh salt between each layer. Care is always taken to employ fresh brine. Red herrings are prepared by leaving the fish at least 24 hours in the brine, and when they are taken out, little twigs are run through the gills, and then they are suspended in a kind of chimney, made on purpose, under which a small fire is made with wood, which produces a good deal of smoke. The herrings remain in this state until they are sufficiently dry, that is to say, about 24 hours. In Sweden and Norway they are somewhat differently prepared. The Icelanders and Greenlanders simply dry them in the air. Anchovy. Sonini thinks that the garum was simply composed of anchovies cooked and crushed in their brine, to which was added a little vinegar and chopped or pounded parsley. The fishermen of the Mediterranean and the coasts of the ocean salt almost all the anchovies they take. They cut off their heads, which are thought to be bitter, take out the entrails, wash them in soft or salt water, and stratify them in barrels with salt. The fishermen of Provence think it is essential to the good preservation of anchovies that the salt be red, and, consequently, they colour it with ochreous earths. Moreover, these fishermen do not change the brine which is formed in the barrels, they simply fill them up when any is lost by evaporation or leakage. The fishermen of the north only use bay salt, and they change the brine 3 times, whence it results that their anchovies keep much longer. But the greater acridness of those which have remained in the same brine is esteemed a good quality by most consumers, and therefore they are much sought after. In seaports, anchovies are eaten either fried or roasted. Salted anchovies are to be preferred when they are new, firm, white outside, vermilion-colored inside, and free from all putrid smell. After having taken out the backbone and washed them well, cooks commonly make use of anchovies in salads and to flavor sauces made with butter, cullis, etc. In this case, they are employed raw. They are not unfrequently fried, after having been deprived of the salt and surrounded with an appropriate paste. Some persons toast slices of bread, cover them with strips of anchovies, and serve them with a sauce composed of oil, vinegar, whole pepper, parsley, scallions, and eschalots, all in abundant quantities and chopped very small. Shellfish. The Emperor Caligula had made immense preparations to invade Great Britain. He set off, and when he arrived in the sight of that Albion he was going to attack, he commanded his troops to form in close array along the shore, the trumpets to sound the charge, and sat himself on the quarter-deck of his galley, from whence he might have directed the action. For a short time he contemplated his warlike cohorts, and having thus gratified his pride, he ordered his troops to pick up the shells which abounded on the strand and return to Rome, where he showed the spolia opima the ocean had delivered up to him. Caligula expected to receive the honours of a triumph, but the Senate, having some sense of modesty left, would not award them, and the implacable Caesar, from that moment, swore the ruin of the senators. The inhabitants of Greece and those of Italy thought a great deal of shellfish, which was always served at the beginning of the repast, just as they came from the sea. Others cooked under the ashes or fried. In most cases they were seasoned with cumin and pepper. The purveyors of fish in Rome gave the preference to those taken in the lake of Lucrinus. The Greeks esteemed those from the promontory of Polaria. The city of Baiae, in Campania, celebrated for its charming position and the unreserved lax manners of its inhabitants, was not less renowned for its culinary labours, and the nicety which presided over their joyful banquets. Apicius has left us the recipe of a most exquisite stew, amphranctum, which the Epicureans of Rome often went to degust among their rivals, the Campanian gastronomists. Cut up oysters, mussels, and sea hedgehogs. Let the pieces be rather small. Put them in a stewpan, with pine almonds fried and chopped, some parsley, rue, pepper, coriander, and cumin. Add, with proper care and discretion, some cooked wine, garum, and oil. Cover and boil the whole for a long time on a slow fire. We will point out the shellfish most in vogue in Italy, and for which the seasoning was generally composed of a mixture of pepper, parsley, dried mint, alisander, a great quantity of cumin, and a little of the decoction of spikenard. Oyster. The pontiffs of pagan Rome, men of exquisite delicacy and matured taste, caused oysters to be served at every repast. This little piece of epicurism was very expensive, and it was necessary for these grave personages to carry the whole of the devotion which characterized them in their love of good cheer to the highest degree, to dare eat of a fish still uncommon a century before the Christian era. At this epoch a baroche, a sort of breakfast, of oysters was worth 100 sesterces, or £9. It is unnecessary to remark that the poor never tasted them. The Greeks and Romans, like ourselves, were remarkably fond of this delicious shellfish, and eat them, French fashion, at the beginning of a banquet. For this reason, Athenian epicures called oysters the gastronomic prelude to the supper. They were often served raw, and were then dexterously opened by a slave on the table, in presence of the guests, whose experienced eyes greedily sought the light purple net which, according to them, surrounds the fattest and best. The inhabitants of Italy preferred large oysters, and exacted that this dainty manna of the sea should always be fresh and abundant at their feasts. This displayed wisdom on their part. This delightful fish excites the appetite and facilitates digestion. To add to its delicate flavour, the Roman Club of Epicureans, a useful association, which modern Europe envies antiquity, caused to be sent from Spain, at a vast expense, that precious garum, the recipe of which seems to have been lost, and the condiment itself forgotten by the whole of the peninsula. The magiric genius of Rome did not hesitate to demonstrate that oysters do not form an exception to the law of perfectibility which governs all beings, and that it is possible to render their flesh more succulent and delicate by transporting them from their damp cradle into reservoirs exposed to the mild influence of the sun. Sergius Orata, or perhaps Fulvius Hirpinus, was the first who received this happy inspiration. He caused to be constructed, near Puzzol, a short time before the civil war of Pompeii, a fish pond, where be stowed oysters, which he fattened with paste and cooked wine worked into the consistence of honey, sapin et fer. This worthy Roman enriched himself by the sale of them, and bequeathed a name to posterity, a twofold happiness for the gastronomist Fulvius, whose good fortune the poet Homer did not partake. Apicius esteemed highly oysters from the lake of Lucrinus, from Berindes and Abydos, and studied deeply the succulent qualities of this shellfish. He knew how to preserve them fat, fresh, and alive, during long and fatiguing journeys, and, thanks to a delicate attention on the part of this immortal bon vivant, the great Trojan was enabled to regale himself with oysters sent from Rome while carrying on a distant war against the Parthians. This present of the king of Epicureans to the master of the world was worthy of both the giver and the receiver, but it completed the ruin of the generous Apicius. The Roman ladies shared their husbands' taste, and eagerly partook of oysters from the lake of Lucrinus, brought into fashion by Sergius Orata, and when their fatigued stomachs struggled painfully with gluttony, this delicacy soon obtained an easy triumph by disposing the appetite to fresh exertions. The means of defense, however, were not very formidable. Sometimes a little warm and limpid water, oftener a dazzling plume from the bird Juno, hastened the struggle and, without effort, decided the victory. This ingenious method was very much relished by polyphagists, and the Emperor Vitellius particularly honoured it. Cape Pelorus furnished the Greeks with highly prized oysters, which were eaten alone, fried, stewed, or nicely dressed with marshmallows, dock leaves, and with some kind of fish. The Romans at length became disgusted with those found on the coasts of Italy, or in the Dardanelles. An instinct of greediness caused them to prefer oysters from the Atlantic Ocean, and especially from the shores of Armorica, now called Brittany. Bordeaux supplied imperial tables, and this distinction is sufficient for its praise. It may not be useless to remark here that no sooner had Ausonius praised this fish in his lines than it was forgotten, and did not reappear till the 17th century on the table of distinguished personages. May our descendants be more just than our forefathers. At Rome, oysters were served with a seasoning of pepper and alisander, mixed with the yolk of eggs, vinegar, garum, oil, wine, and a little honey. They were preserved in a vase smeared with pitch, washed with vinegar, and hermetically closed. Oysters of a fine quality are generally of easy digestion, but not very nourishing, particularly when eaten raw. They are sought for to open the appetite, which is the case owing to the nature of the water, agreeably salted, contained in them. Some mention is made of persons who can eat from 15 to 20 dozen without being ill. It is not the same when cooked. Then they become hard, more tough, and consequently indigestible. They are also eaten pickled with vinegar and sweet herbs. In this state they are sent to countries distant from the sea, piled upon one another, without the shell, in small barrels. De Blainville. Sea hedgehog. Under this denomination were classed all animals more or less orbicular, whose envelope bristles with calcareous points, on which account they were compared to hedgehogs. The Greeks thought them delicious when caught at the full moon, and prepared with vinegar, sweet cooked wine, parsley, and mint. Oxymel often replaced vinegar. The Romans also esteemed highly this dish, which was recommended to sluggish appetites under the auspices of the faculty. And Apicius furnished the following recipe for the preparation of it. Procure a new saucepan, thus says the great master, place it in a little oil, garum, sweet wine, and pepper. When the mixture begins to boil, stuff the sea hedgehogs, then submit them to the action of a slow fire, add a large quantity of pepper, and serve. Mussel. The two great nations of antiquity have granted uncommon praise to mussels, and partook of them at their most sumptuous feasts. At the wedding repast of the graceful Hebe, Jupiter wished the inhabitants of Olympus to exchange for this shellfish their celestial though monotonous ambrosia. Epicharmus, who records the fact, does not inform us with what the sauce the chef de cuisine of the gods dressed the flesh of those mussels. The reader must thus content himself with the seasoning invented by simple mortals, and which appeared good to them. It was composed of a suitable mixture of pepper, alisander, parsley, mint with a quantity of cumin seed, a little honey, vinegar, and garum. With this mixture they covered the boiled and widely opened mussels, and the guests found it impossible to satiate themselves with this dish, so much more digestible and nourishing than oysters. Scallop. The effeminate inhabitants of Tarentum, the abode of luxury, delighted in good living, and boasted of possessing the finest scallops of Campania, and of the whole empire. The infallible authority of this voluptuous city in the matters of taste gave a surprising vogue to this fish. Rome, and all the population of Italy, believed it was forced to eat the scallops of Tarentum prepared with oysters, and at other times with mussels. It now remains to be mentioned that some kinds of testacea appeared worthy of the reputation they acquired among the ancients. Tortoise. The Greeks and Latins speak with admiration of the enormous size of certain tortoises in their time, the whole species of which were comprised under the generic word testudo. The Indian Sea produced some so large that the shell of one only amply served to roof a comfortable and elegant cottage. The inhabitants of the shores of the Red Sea never troubled themselves with building sloops. Large shells of tortoises spared them the trouble by supplying them with charming little barks, which lightly floated on the water. And lastly, in the Ganges, tortoise shells were found capable of containing no less than 20 amphorae, or about 560 pints. The inhabitants of Peloponnesus did the tortoise the signal honour of representing its image on their money. The blood cured diseases of the eye, and the flesh, in great request, was thought excellent eating. It was cut into pieces of a middling size, and placed in a saucepan with pepper, rue, and scallions, crushed in the same mortar. Over this was poured honey, garum, raisin wine, common wine, and a small quantity of good oil. At the moment of ebullition the whole was thickened with flour. Sometimes the tortoise was boiled and covered with a seasoning, for which the following is the recipe. Mix pepper, alisander, parsley, mint, and wild marjoram, with the yolks of eggs, honey, garum, wine, cooked wine, and oil. Add mustard and vinegar. Sea crawfish. Apicius sought relief from his culinary studies at Minturnus in Campania, where that great master regaled himself with delicious sea crawfish, in order to keep up his gustatory powers. Genius reposes amidst studious leisure. Being told that Africa produced some of these testacea of an immense size, immediately the worthy Roman tears himself away from the sweet solitude he had created. He freights a vessel. Aeolus smiles on the undertaking. Neptune protects him, and he arrives in the sight of the African shore. Scarcely was he disembarked when some fishermen brought him a few sea crawfish. He examines, rejects them, and demands finer ones be brought. He is informed that it will be impossible to procure any larger than those before him. At this Apicius smiles disdainfully, and commanding the presence of his pilot, orders him to steer back for Italy. Decidedly, magiric genius never revealed itself by a more sublime action. However, Pliny somewhere mentions certain magnificent sea crawfish, which he describes as being 4 cubits in length, very large ones certainly. Roman tables often presented to the sight of guests boiled sea crawfish, peppered and garnished with asparagus, but they were generally covered with a gravy composed of honey, vinegar, wine, garum, oil, and cooked wine, to which were added scallions, chopped small, pepper, alisander, carrots, cumin, and dates. Mustard was then mixed with the whole. Lobster. Antiquity rendered justice to the lobster, and the taste for it did not change, being founded on truly estimable and sterling qualities. It was opened lengthwise and filled with gravy, into the composition of which entered both pepper and coriander. It was then slowly cooked on the gridiron, and every now and then basted with the same kind of gravy, with which the flesh became impregnated. River crayfish. The Greeks were remarkably fond of this fish, especially when obtained from Alexandria. They were not less esteemed in Rome, where they eat them boiled with cumin, and seasoned with pepper, alisander, parsley, dried mint, and a great quantity of cumin, the whole carefully and well ground, and mixed with honey, vinegar, and garum, to which was sometimes added some liquid perfume. Crayfishes can be preserved several days, not too warm, in baskets with some fresh grass, such as the nettle, or in a bucket with 3/8 of an inch of water. If there were enough water in it to cover them, they would die in a few moments, because their great consumption of air does not allow them to live in water unless it is continually renewed. Bosc. Crab. Would you like to eat crab sausages? Boil some of these animals, reduce them to a pulp, mix with this some spikenard, garum, pepper, and eggs. Give to this the ordinary shape of sausages. Place them on the stove or gridiron, and you will by these means obtain a delicate and tempting dish. Apicius assures us of the fact. Apicius was a connoisseur. A crab may also be served whole, boiled, and accompanied by a seasoning of pepper, cumin, and rue, which the cook skilfully mixes with garum, honey, oil, and vinegar. Is it preferred stuffed? Then fill it with a skilful mixture of cumin, mint, rue, alisander, pine nuts, and pepper, the whole long soaked in garum, honey, vinegar, and wine. Frogs. The ancients thought nothing of frogs, which they left at liberty to propagate. There was such a great number among the Abderites that these good people gave up to them their native soil, and left the place in search of another spot. At the present day, in some countries, frogs are sought for as a most agreeable and wholesome food. In other parts, England in particular, they are disdainfully shunned. But in France there is a great consumption of them, especially in the spring. About a century since, they were greatly in fashion at Paris, and it is stated that a countryman from the province of Auvergne, named Simon, made a considerable fortune by feeding and fattening them in one of the suburbs of that city, which were sent to him from Auvergne. In Germany, the various parts of the frog are eaten, the skin and intestine excepted, but in France they are satisfied with the hind legs, which, by the size of their muscles, are themselves equivalent to all the rest. They are dressed with wine as fish, with white or brown sauce, fried or roasted. When tender and properly done, it is a most delicate dish. Bosc. Before the conclusion of this article, we may as well mention the frightful dish which modern good taste has banished from our tables, but which the ancients allowed to reappear at theirs. It is the polypus, highly esteemed in both Greece and Italy, when caught at a certain period, and its numerous immoderate legs stretched far over the edges of the dish prepared to receive it. This monster was cut in pieces, and eaten with a sauce composed of pepper, garum, and benzoin. It will be easily understood that ancient nations must have early accustomed themselves to fishing, the origin of which, doubtless, goes back to the first ages of civilization. The holy writings often mention fishermen, fishhooks, and nets. Homer speaks of them, and the poet Hesiod, who flourished 30 years before Homer, places on the shield of Hercules an attentive fisherman ready to throw his net over some fish pursued by a dolphin. The Egyptians also practiced this occupation, of which the following anecdote is a proof. Antony, being in Egypt, the beauteous Cleopatra sought to amuse him by inventing for his entertainment each day new kinds of pleasure. But the Roman general, seized with a violent love of fishing, fled from the society of his numerous courtiers, and alone on the borders of the sea or an isolated lake, vainly waiting for the smallest gudgeon, he forgot long hours of vain expectancy and useless patience. The queen undertook his cure. She commanded a diver to plunge into the water, and there hook a fish to the line of Antony. He, seeing it agitated, joyfully withdrew it from the water and unhooked a salted sardine. Cleopatra then exclaimed, "Leave to the Egyptians the task of fishing. Romans should take only kings, cities, and emperors. The inhabitants of Italy fished exactly in the same manner as we do this day, but Roman luxury, always greedy of extravagant profusion, invented those celebrated fish ponds which cost immense sums both to build and maintain, and to which Lucilius, Hortensius, and Philippus, whom Cicero surnamed the Tritons of fish pools, consecrated almost entirely their anxiety and fortunes. This folly was carried to such a height that fish ponds were constructed on the roofs of houses. More reasonable persons contented themselves with bringing river water into their dining rooms. The fish swam under the table, and it was only necessary to stoop and pick them out the instant before eating them. These expensive habits could only suit the most opulent and the least numerous class of Romans. The honest citizen modestly provided himself at the fish market, and the part not eaten by him the first day was submitted to a very simple process, which assured its preservation. For this it was only necessary to cover it with boiling vinegar as soon as it had been fried. Fish was also well preserved by surrounding it with snow, and placing it at the bottom of an ice-house. End of section 23. Recording by Corinne LePage.